Good evening, everybody, and good evening to everybody who's joining us online. Tonight's lesson: when a moment counts, one less second of pain is worth the world. Good evening. So, at the end of this week's Parsha, there's a very interesting episode with Miriam. Miriam is the sister of Moshe Rabbeinu. Todah. The sister of Moshe Rabbeinu. And this episode is enshrined in Jewish practice such that every day we are enjoined to remember this episode. If you take a look at the end of the prayers every day, there's, at least in our Siddur, there you go, 6 remembrances. 6 things we're supposed to remember. We're supposed to remember Sinai. We're supposed to remember Zachar Seima Shabbos the Kaddish. We're supposed to remember Sabbath. What else do we remember? We remember the story with Miriam. So this story appears at the end of this week's Parsha, where we have a conversation that takes place between Miriam and her brother Aaron, both of whom were prophets, and they begin to speak of Moshe. They begin to speak about Moshe, and apparently the conversation is not a positive one. So here's what the Torah tells us. In text number 1a, page 156, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe regarding the Cushite woman that he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. They said, had God spoken only to Moses? Did God only speak to Moses? God only speak to Moses. He spoke to us also. Hasn't he spoken to us too? And God heard. Now this man Moses was exceedingly humble, more so than any person on the face of the earth. So this is where the Torah tells us the famous statement about Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe was the most humble person on the entire earth. And by the way, Moshe actually wrote this. It's interesting. Moshe wrote this pasuk that tells us about his own humility. And just if I can digress for just a brief moment, what is the Torah actually telling us here? Moshe was a very humble person. Evening. And Moshe's humility wasn't weakness, wasn't a lack of awareness of his great strengths and his great potential and his great spiritual heights that he had reached, but rather his humility was born out of a recognition that those things are merely gifts from God. And if somebody else was blessed with those same gifts, they would do a better job at utilizing them. And that's real humility. That's real humility. Humility isn't meekness, isn't a lack of confidence and a lack of ambition and a lack of strength. You could be very humble and super confident and super strong and super determined all at the same time. And that's what Moshe really embodied. Now, what was it that they were saying about it? So in text number 1b, we read in Rashi. Rashi, again, this is on the verse in Bamidbar 12:1-3. It appears on our student book on page 157. So here's what it says. Miriam and Aaron spoke. She spoke first, meaning Miriam spoke first. Therefore, the Torah mentions her first. How did she know that Moshe had separated from his wife? Rabbi Nosson says, Miriam was beside Tzipporah when Moshe was told that 2 of the elders, Eldad and Medad, were prophesying in the camp. When Tzipporah heard this, she said, woe to their wives, woe to their wives if they are required to prophecy, for they will separate from their wives just as my husband separated from me. From this, Miriam knew about it and told Aaron. In other words, Miriam had heard from Tzipporah, who remarked when she heard that Eldad and Medad, who were one of the 72 elders that were designated by Moshe to extend his prophecy forward and radiate his prophecy forward. So she hears about Eldad and Medad and she says, oh my gosh, are they going to go through exactly what I went through? So Miriam picks this up. Now if Miriam, who did not intend to disparage him, meaning Moshe, was punished, all the more so someone who intentionally disparages his fellow. Now Rashi comments on the words, the Cushite woman, that the pasuk talked about. This teaches that everyone acknowledged her beauty just as everyone acknowledges a Cushite's blackness. Cushite, the numerical value, says Rashi, of Cushis is equal to Yifas Mare, beautiful in appearance. And then Rashi comments on the words regarding the woman, meaning the Cushite woman that he took, concerning her divorce. So they were conversing, they were discussing this woman's divorce, meaning they were discussing Tzipporah's divorce from her husband. For he had married a Cushite woman. What does this apparently superfluous clause mean to say? You find a woman who is beautiful in appearance but unpleasant in deed, or a woman who is pleasant indeed but not of beautiful appearance. This one, however, was pleasant in every respect. Therefore, she was called Cushite, which connotes beauty, as explained above. The Cushite woman, concludes Rashi, and now he divorced her, because Moshe had to be on call for God to be able to express and to manifest prophecy through him at every moment. So similar to the way we find the Jews before the Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah, we are told that for 3 days or for 2 days, depending on the opinion that we learned before Shavuos, it was necessary for all married people to separate and to abstain from marital intercourse. So in the same way, to be able to accept, to be able to be a vessel for divine prophecy at any moment, Moshe was not able to be married at that stage of the game, at that point. So he decided to divorce her. And this was her grievance that she was expressing. Eldad and Medad, I hope they don't go through what I went through. Okay. So Miriam hears about this conversation and she's disappointed. And so she decides, so she's talking about it with Aaron. And then Hashem hears the way they're talking, and he's not happy. He's not happy. And so he's going to once and for all clarify for Moshe's siblings who exactly Moshe really is. So in text number 2, page 159. God suddenly said to Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, go out, all 3 of you, to the tent of meeting. And all 3 went out. God descended in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent. He called to Aaron and Miriam, and they both went out. He said, please listen to my words. If there be prophets among you, I, God, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak to him in a dream. Not so is my servant Moshe. These are words which are awesome. They're awesome words. Not so is my servant Moshe. He is faithful throughout my house. B'chol beisi ne'emonhu. He's trustworthy in my entire house. Whatever that means, the divine reality. With him I speak mouth to mouth in a vision and not in riddles. And he beholds the image of God, whatever the image of God really means. So why were you not afraid? Why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moshe? Why weren't you afraid to speak against my servant Moshe? The wrath of God flared against them, and he left. Meaning the vision departed, the prophecy departed. The cloud departed from above the tent, and behold, Miriam was afflicted with saras, as white as snow. She had leprosy. Then Aaron turned to Miriam, and behold, she was afflicted with saras. So Miriam now is stricken with saras. And we learn from this the importance of guarding what we say, the idea of lashon hara, of not engaging in evil talk, gossip. And now what does Miriam have to do? She needs to spend 7 days in isolation outside of the entire machana, the entire settlement, all of the camps, the entire camp. She has to leave all 3 camps. There was these 3 circular camps that made up the camp of the Jewish people, and she had to leave all of them. In text number 3a, page 168, page 161. Aaron said to Moshe, please, Master, do not put sin upon us for acting foolishly and for sinning. Let her not be like the dead, which comes out of his mother's womb with half his flesh consumed. Moshe cried out to God, saying, I beseech you, God, please heal her. These are words that are then inserted in the famous liturgy that we recite Friday night, and you did nefesh, keil no refonala. This is where it comes from. God, please, I beseech you, God, please heal her. God replied to Moshe, if her father were to spit on her face, would she not be humiliated for 7 days? She shall be confined for 7 days outside the camp, and afterward she may enter. So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not travel until Miriam was brought in again. Then the people departed from Chatzeres, and they camped in the desert of Paran. Now Rashi tells us on this pasuk, text number 3b, page 162, the people did not travel. This honor was accorded her by the omnipresent, meaning by God, because of the time she remained with Moshe when he was cast into the river. As it says, his sister stood by from afar to know what would be done with him. What is the story? We probably know the story, but it's probably worthwhile just to review it briefly. Yocheved, Moshe's mother, knows about the terrible decree that Pharaoh had just signed into law, that all male children had to be cast into the river. They're going to kill, Rachmana litzlan, every Jewish baby boy. And they knew that she was expecting, they knew what to look out for. She gives birth, and in order to save Moshe, what does she do? She takes the baby and she puts the baby into a small basket, protected, and she puts him into the water. Because don't forget, at that time, a lot of what they used to do in Egypt was based on what they saw in the stars, and apparently they saw in the stars that this child was going to be lokui. He's going to ultimately be smitten by water. Little did they know that it was a reference to what was going to happen later on in his lifetime, where he sinned with the story of hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Anyway, so Yocheved puts him into the water, and what does Miriam do? She's the faithful, caring sibling. She goes and she stands next to the water to see what's going on. In text number 4, here's what the story is, and if we pay attention to the text, we won't have to review the text later when we revisit the story. A man of the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. This is, of course, Amram, a reference to Amram. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw him, that he was good, she hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she took for him a reed basket, smeared it with clay and pitch, placed the child into it, and put it into the marsh at the Nile's edge. The marsh meaning that where the tall grass grows. His sister stood by from afar to know what would be done with him. Paro's daughter went down to bathe to the Nile, and her maidens were walking along the Nile, and she saw the basket in the midst of the marsh. And she sent her maidservant, and she took it. She opened it, and she saw him, the child, and behold, he was weeping. He was a weeping lad, and she had compassion on him, and she said, "This is one of the children of the Hebrews." She recognized that he was Jewish. His sister said to Paro's daughter, meaning Miriam, "Shall I go and call for you a wet nurse from the Hebrew women, so that she shall nurse the child for you?" Paro's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Perfect, a beautiful story. Paro's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. Okay. 81 years pass. 81 years later, and Miriam is now rewarded for what she did then by the entire nation waiting 7 days until she was able to experience her purification process. This is all a reward for what she did then. She waited then for Moshe, and so now they're waiting for her. And the Mishnah in Tractate Sota tells us in text number 5, page 165, in the measure that a person measures, so it is measured out to him or her. So this idea of midah kineged midah, we've heard this expression before, meaning whatever we measure and we do towards others, ultimately that's the measure that returns back to us. The same is so with regard to the reward for good deeds. Miriam waited for Moshe for 1 hour at the shore of the Nile, as it is stated, and his sister stood by from afar to know what would be done to him. Therefore, the Jewish people delayed their travels in the desert for 7 days to wait for her when she was smitten with leprosy. As it is stated, and Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days. And the people did not travel until Miriam was brought in again. So here, as the Talmud tells us, Miriam's reward was greater in measure than the good deed that she did. She waited for just a little bit. for an hour, for some, we're going to see soon. Not exactly an hour. She waited for some time, and then everybody else waits for 7 days. So you see here the idea that merub mamida teva, which means when somebody does something good, so the reward for that is going to be that much greater. When somebody does something that's bad, so the responses, the retribution is going to be aligned completely with what they did. They're not going to get a greater punishment than what they did. Here you see that with regard to good deeds, the reward is many times greater.
But it's not always in this lifetime, no?
Okay.
I'm asking, is it true or not?
For sure it's true.
Because I see many people doing great things and their destinies.
Yeah, so these are all things that Hashem knows, Hashem judges, and the ultimate reward is not just in the Olam HaNeshamas, but really ultimately in Tchias HaMesim, when Mashiach will come and the dead are resurrected. That's when the primary reward will be brought about. Why? Because it was the body with the soul that did the mitzvah, and so that's why the body needs to be rewarded for the good deed that they did. Just to reward the soul on its own in the Olam HaNeshamas and Gan Eden, that doesn't cut it. You have
so there will be no Olam Neshamot when the Mashiach will come and
all Neshamas will return back into bodies.
So when somebody had several carnations, to which body will come?
That's an excellent question, but I'm afraid to derail from the lesson. But the truth of the matter is that the soul, because it's like a lamp, because it's like a candle, which could light many candles, so you can create many flames from one flame, so it's all an extension of the first flame. So whatever flame was vested within that person, that's the one that's it's going to return to. Okay, we'll get back to that Mir Hashem later. Let's move into text number 6a. The Talmud asks, are these matters, meaning Miriam waiting for Moshe and the Jewish people waiting for her, comparable? There Miriam waited 1 hour, while here the Jewish people waited for her for 7 days. Rava said, this is what the Mishnah is teaching. And the same is so with regard to the reward of good deeds. It is rewarded with the same measure, meaning a person is rewarded in the same manner as the good deed, but the measure of good is always greater than the measure of punishment. Therefore, Miriam was rewarded in the same manner, but in a greater measure than her deed, because that's the way it works with positive action. And there's a fascinating teaching over here in the Tosfos. The Tosfos is one of the commentaries on the Talmud. The Tosfos tells us that if you take a look, the Tosfos is of the opinion that the hour that was described earlier, that she waited, it's not really an hour. It's like a third of an hour. How much is 500 times a third of an hour? Well, we have 168 hours in a week. Divided by 500, what do you get? About 0.33. 0.33. So basically, that's what you have. You have a third of an hour. She waited a third of an hour. Everybody else waited for an entire week, meaning 500 times the measure, 500 times the amount of the deed that she actually did. Okay, so in text number 6b, page 167, Miriam waited for Moshe for 1 hour. Thank you, Alan. Miriam waited for Moshe for 1 hour. The Mishnah doesn't mean exactly 1 hour, but rather she waited for 1/3 or 1/4 of an hour. For we have learned in the Tosefta, God's attribute of goodness exceeds the attribute of retribution by a ratio of 1 to 500. So it's 1 to 500. She waited for a third of an hour, and 500 times that is what? It's an entire week. Gosh, you could imagine how much time we've got on our hands. 500 times a third of an hour.
Where did 500 come from?
That's what the Tosefta says. Not sure where they get it from. They must get it from some tradition or whatever, but that's what it says. So Tosefta says, based on that Tosefta, we could explain. She waited there for a third of an hour. 500 times that is an entire week. Therefore, everybody waited for an entire week.
It's not Gematria?
Doesn't seem to be that way.
But if you calculate it...
Okay. So now, this seems to be a very nice bright spot in the story. Because Miriam was kind, Miriam was extra kind, she went out of her way and she waited. So, that's why everybody else waited for her. Now let me ask you a question. What would have happened if she didn't have that merit? She didn't have the merit of standing by Moshe. Would people not wait for her? Would they just abandon her in the desert and let her rot there?
I don't believe so, because she was a leader. And,
She was a prophetess.
But it seems like from this narrative that it's only because she had this specific merit that's why they waited. If not, they probably would have abandoned her.
maybe because of that merit, she became a propheter and a leader, or she had, I don't know.
She was definitely a prophetess before, because it says by Kriyas Yamsuf, says by the splitting of the sea, right after Moshe is done with the recital of Az Yashir, with this great song, Atan Lohem Miriam. And Miriam goes out to sing. She sings with the women. So clearly already then she was a prophetess. She was a leader. So the question becomes, 1 second, does this mean that if it wasn't for the fact that she had this merit, then what, she would be left behind? That's the question. Another question, what did they do with anybody else that was afflicted with saras, with leprosy, that had to remain outside the camp? Did they just leave them there also for the dead? What did they do with them? So in text number 7, at first glance, it is understood that if the Jewish people would not wait for Miriam, the fact that she would have been left alone in the desert would have amounted to simply not being accorded honor. In other words, the fact that she would have been left over is because why? Because we're not giving her any special respect. There's no special honor we have to accord her. She's not deserving of any extra honor because she didn't do anything. In other words, in the absence of this special merit, we wouldn't be according her with any special honor. So what would we do? We just leave her out for the dead? But this is very surprising. If she were to remain alone in the desert, it would have been a matter of life and death, not merely of not being accorded honor. That's the question. So in order to understand this, and what was done with all the others who were smitten with leprosy, so let's begin over here with the pasuk that we took a look at earlier. In text number 8, God replied to Moshe, if her father were to spit in her face, would she not be humiliated for 7 days? She shall be confined for 7 days. Where? Where is she supposed to be confined for 7 days?
Outside the camp.
Outside the camp. That's going to be the key phrase here. And afterwards, she may enter. So she had to remain michutz lamachna, outside of the camp. And the same also applies, obviously, to all the other Mitzurayim, all the others who suffered from leprosy.
So all of them suffered from leprosy because of Lashon Hara?
Generally speaking, that was the case, yeah. Sometimes it was a different Aveda, sometimes it was a different sin or something. In text number 9a, command the children of Israel, this is already going back to last week's Parsha, command the children of Israel to banish from the camp all those afflicted with saras or with a male discharge, and all those unclean through contact with the dead. In text number 9b, page 170, to banish from the camp, Rashi tells us, at the time of their encampment, and this is going to be the key phrase here, at the time of their encampment, there were 3 camps. Within the curtains of the Mishkan courtyard was the camp of the Shechina, the encampment of the Levites surrounding it. Like I explained before, there were 3 concentric circles. As described in Parshas Bamidbar, was the Levite camp. From there until the edge of the camp of the divisions on all 4 sides was the Israelite camp. Anyone afflicted with saras was expelled from all 3 of them. Okay. But that all applies when Bishas Chani Yoson, this was the language of Rashi. Bishas Chani Yoson, at the time of their encampment. You see that right at the beginning of Rashi in text number 10.9b. It says, to banish from the camp, when? At the time of their encampment. When they're encamping, when they rest, when they stop traveling, that's when the Mitzayra, that's when the one who's afflicted with leprosy is commanded to be outside of the entire camp. What happens when it's no longer time to camp? Then there's no obligation to be outside the camp. Then the leper can be included, can integrate with the society at large and just continue with the travels. So that answers the question, so what did we do with all the lepers while we were traveling? Well, we're going to leave them for dead? No, we're not going to leave them for dead, because the whole obligation only begins when everybody stops, when there's a camp. when there's an encampment. When there's no encampment, then there's no obligation to be anywhere. You just walk with everybody else. So whatever applied to all the rest of the lepers applied to Miriam as well. So that answers the question. No, there was no life or death issue over here. It was just a matter of honor that was accorded to her. Everybody waited. In text number 10, God's statement that Miriam be confined for 7 days outside the camp and afterwards she may enter indicates that Miriam's cure after re-entering the camp depends on being confined for 7 days outside the camp, outside the 3 camps. In this context, the definition of camp, which is etymologically related to the word encampment, applies only at the time of encampment. And consequently, so does the need to be quarantined outside the camp, as Rashi has already explained earlier. By contrast, when the nation traveled, the term outside the camp, the 3 camps, could not be applied, because what did they do? They all traveled not in an encampment. It's true that there was a whole order to how they were supposed to, how the formation was made. But still, there was no encampment. The obligation only applies when there's an actual encampment. So what did this all accomplish? What this all accomplished was the following. Had Miriam not been given the opportunity to wait for 7 days outside the encampment, and God were to say, okay, folks, by Yisro, it's time to travel. Let's go. What would happen? Miriam would remain a leper. She would remain a leper. Yes, she would walk together with everybody else, but she would remain a leper. She wouldn't achieve ritual purity. So she could potentially just have gone on for, another week, another 2 weeks, another month until they got to Israel. Until the next time they were to encamp for more than 7 days. So what this did is it sped up, it expedited the time that it would take for Miriam to achieve ritual purity. It simply expedited everything. In text number 11, if the Jewish people would not have waited in the camp for those 7 days of Miriam's confinement, she obviously wouldn't have remained alone in the desert, and she would have traveled along with them. However, inasmuch as she would have been unable to fulfill the commandment to remain confined for 7 days outside the camp, she wouldn't be able to fulfill that mitzvah of being confined for 7 days. For while traveling, they would not constitute a camp. The time until Miriam's re-entry would end up taking longer than 7 days. For the travel time would not be included in her 7 days of confinement because she wasn't being confined. During the time of the travel, we can't include time of encampment, a time of confinement during that time. She would have to wait until they actually encamp again, and then she leaves the camp and she waits there for 7 days. So this expedited the process. So no, she would not languish alone outside in the desert, and she just simply would have traveled from Chatzotzres to Midbar Paran, as the pasuk described earlier, and that's what she would have done. Now the question needs to be asked. Wait a second. Let's take a moment to pause. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on this. Didn't she save Moshe's life here? By helping find somebody, a wet nurse. So she saved Moshe's life, no? So, this is the question that Rebbe next asks over here in the Sikha, in text number 12, page 174. We can ask, how is the honor accorded to her by the omnipresent an appropriate reward for the time she remained with Moshe? Her deed was a matter of saving Moshe's life when he was cast into the river. How then is the honor accorded to her by the omnipresent a fitting reward for that? If God is simply a cause that they should expedite the process, she shouldn't have to wait, how is that a fitting reward? How is that parallel to what she did? She saved Moshe's life, the leader of the Jewish people, and now what's the big deal? Oh, they waited for her. So we need to take a closer look at what it is that she did, and we already read that text in text number 13a. We already really looked at that text earlier. And, it would seem also that any normal person would do the same thing. You see a woman putting a baby into the river, so you're going to go and you're going to stand there just to see what's going on, either out of curiosity or out of concern, to make sure that everything is okay. It seems like this wasn't such an amazing feat. That's another question we could ask. So let's revisit the story in text number 13a. A man of the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw him, that he was good, she hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she took for him a reed basket, smeared it with clay and pitch, placed the child into it, and put it into the marsh at the Nile's edge. His sister stood by from afar to know what would be done to him. Paro's daughter went down to bathe to the Nile, and her maidens were walking along the Nile, and she saw the basket in the midst of the marsh. And she went, and she sent her maidservant, and she took it. Okay, so we know the story. She goes and opens it. She sees that she's the child of the Hebrews. And the sister says, Shnu, should I go call a wet nurse? She said, yeah, go call a wet nurse. I'll pay her, etc. That's the whole story. So now, Miriam really couldn't do anything about the circumstances. If, for example, the Egyptian soldiers were to find Moshe, a child of the Hebrews, so she would be no match for them. So what was she really able to accomplish over here? What she was able to accomplish is that she was able to get a wet nurse earlier. Again, here, she expedited the process. Because here the child, we're told, in text number 13b, this is from Rashi, and this is also an amazing thing. Here's what Rashi tells us about Moshe when he's found by the daughter of Paro. Shall I go and call for you a wet nurse from the Hebrew women? This teaches us that Paro's daughter had taken him around to many Egyptian women to nurse, but he did not nurse because he was destined to speak with the Shekhinah. Because he was destined to speak with the Shekhinah, his mouth would communicate with the Shekhinah, so it was not appropriate for him to nurse from Egyptian women. So as a result, instinctively, Moshe refused to nurse from them. So what would happen? She notices that this is the child of the Hebrews. She tries to get a wet nurse from the Egyptians. It's not working. She wants the child to survive. So what's she going to do automatically? Ultimately, she's going to find a Hebrew wet nurse on her own. What did Miriam do? Miriam expedited the process. Miriam right away just jumped in and said, should I get you a Hebrew wet nurse? She saw it wasn't working with the Egyptian women.
But where it's written that it's not working with the Egyptian nurse?
This is from the Medrash.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely not in the pasuk itself.
Okay.
And the Egyptian woman didn't, she saw Miriam standing there. Did she realize what she was standing there for? Or she didn't know who Miriam was?
Who, Bastia, who, the daughter of Paro?
Yeah.
It seems like
Miriam was there to help out, but did she know that Miriam was there?
Miriam let her know that she was there.
Oh, and she was a Hebrew woman?
Clearly, if she was offering to find her a Hebrew wet nurse, then it was clear that she's a Jewish woman, and that she was offering to get involved.
But she was a child to begin with.
A pretty mature child at that, apparently.
She was like 12, Miriam? How old was she?
I don't recall exactly what age she was. But she was old enough. In fact, I wanted to mention earlier, I just didn't want to get off track. When we read in the Pasuk, we read over here in text number 13a and earlier, a man of the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. So I believe Rashi already comments based on the Medrash, or the Gemara, I don't recall, one of them, that what happened actually was that Amram was already married to Yocheved earlier, but had divorced. Once they learned of this terrible decree that their children were going to be put to death, Amram was like, I'm not doing this again. So he got divorced. And so their daughter Miriam goes and pleads with her father not to do that, to come back. And that's what he does. That's why the pasuk says, "Vayikach ish mi beis Levi, vayikach es bas Levi." There was a man from the house of Levi who took a daughter of Levi. The commentaries explain what all of this implies, all the nuances here imply. But that's the point. The point is that she herself was mature enough to realize that this was the right thing to do. So she was obviously, forward thinking in that respect.
So she was already born, and there was another brother that.
Aaron.
No, but you said there was another that he said, "I'm not doing it again," meaning.
No, he's not. He's afraid of it. He's afraid of it. In other words, he's not getting married again. That's what I'm saying. He's not going to have children more. That was the point. So anyway, the bottom line is Miriam here steps in, and what does she do? She expedites the process to find a Hebrew wet nurse.
So why isn't Miriam also rewarded for bringing them back together,
Good point.
with mother and father?
It's a good question. Good question. Quite a question to look up. But what's the point here? In text number 14, it is understood that even if Miriam hadn't been there, Paro's daughter would eventually have determined that she must find a Jewish woman because she had taken him around to many Egyptian women to nurse, but he did not nurse. But then the process of finding a nurse for Moshe would have taken longer. The accomplishment of Miriam standing by from afar was that she shortened the duration of Moshe's pain. The child is crying, the child is hungry, and what did she do? She acted immediately. She didn't let this go on for too long. The child is crying. They open up the box, they open up the table, they open up the basket. Okay, so who's going to try to nurse him? Try to nurse him. Oh, this one, it's not going. Doesn't want to nurse. Oh, could I find you a Hebrew wet nurse?
But this is very strange that the hungry baby would not want to be nursed.
Well, that's what we explained earlier, because he was going to communicate ultimately with the Shekhinah, so therefore instinctively he had this holiness within him that he refused to nurse from an Egyptian woman. So that's the idea here. She expedited the process, and therefore the process was expedited for her. Mm-hmm. She paid heed to the cry of a child, and so everybody paid heed to her cry of pain later on, and they waited a lot longer, 500 times longer than the time that it took her, the time that she spent watching what was going on. And so that's the point. That's the point of this narrative. That's the point of this narrative, and that's the point, I believe, of the remembering what happened with Miriam, because what we're remembering is the attentiveness that we need to have, paying attention to the cry of a child. There's a story that they tell of an Israeli soldier who was standing guard somewhere, I don't recall exactly where, and the soldier was shot. And the soldier falls and is bleeding, and he's bleeding to death. Another soldier standing a little distance away, and he hears a shot, and he goes to see what happened, and he finds his comrade over here. Comrade is shot and is bleeding, and he starts to put pressure on the place of the wound and stop the bleeding, and he feels like he literally has the life of this soldier in his hand. He's putting pressure and he's calling for help. And finally help comes, they take him to the hospital. Ultimately the soldier recovers. And it seems like the story is over. But the parents of the soldier want to know, who was this angel? Who was this soldier who helped him? They couldn't find it. They couldn't find who it was, because the guy had immediately disappeared. He brought him. He helped him to the hospital. And after that, he left. Like, well, what's he going to do? It's not his best friend. He's not. He doesn't. Whatever. He just figured he did what he had to do. He did what a regular soldier would do, which is protect and help save the life of a comrade. He brought him to safety, and that's it. Now it's over. So they put up signs in different places. The story. The soldier was shot, he was bleeding. There was a soldier who came to help. He heard the shot, he paid attention, and he came. Finally, somebody turns up, and I believe it was because they had a sign in their store. They had a sign in their store about this. These people had a, whatever you call it. What do you call a... Makolet, Makolet, exactly. And they arranged, they figured out who it was, they arranged that the fathers should be able to meet, the mother should be able to meet, the sons should be able to meet. And it was a very emotional gathering. And they said thank you, and they exchanged embrace, and it was a very warm encounter. But then the mother of the soldier who was the savior pulls the mother of the soldier who was wounded aside, and she says, "Look at me. Do you recognize me?"
The mother of
The mother of the soldier.
I know the story.
The mother of the soldier. You heard the story. Okay, you can hear it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Great story.
So the mother turns to the other mother and she says, "Do you recognize me?" In other words, the mother of the one who, the mother of the savior, of the soldier who saved his comrade, turns to this other woman, and she says, "Do you remember me?" She says, "No, I don't remember you. Look at me. Look at you. No, I don't remember you. I'm sorry, I don't remember you. Remind me." So she said, "I'll tell you the story. It was about 20 years ago. I used to shop at your place. I wanted to give you the business. I used to shop at your store. And one time I was very downtrodden. I was very, very depressed. And you had asked me what's going on. So I told you. I told you what's going on. I'm in the midst of getting divorced. And I found out that I'm pregnant. And I'm really considering an abortion. So immediately you sat me down together with your husband, and you sat there talking to me about the joy of motherhood, the beauty of motherhood, the beauty and the importance of not aborting a child. And ultimately you convinced me not to abort. So I didn't abort. That was 20 years ago. That child that was born, that's my son. That's the son that saved your son. So because you paid attention to what I was going through and you convinced me not to have an abortion, so I had a child who grew up to be the one who's going to save your child from what was going to be certain death. So this story highlights the importance of paying attention to what's going on in another person's life, paying attention, heeding the cry of another human being. This also reminds me of the story. This, of course, is a story about saving somebody's physical life. There's a story that's told of the Alter Rebbe's grandchild. The Alter Rebbe lived in Liadi, and his son, the Bittul Rebbe, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, lived in the same house, I guess on the top floor. There were 2 floors, he lived on the top floor. Now his son, Reb Dov Ber, who became the second Rebbe, had an incredible mind, an incredibly deep mind, and very extremely powerful intellect. And when he entered into a state of deep concentration, it was very difficult to shake him from that concentration. It was very difficult to wake him up, to take him out of that deep state of meditation or focus on the learning. So it happened one night that his son, that the Bittul Rebbe, is sitting in his study, or in his study, whatever it is, and he's studying, and he's so deeply engrossed in the learning that he doesn't hear how one of his children had fallen out of the bassinet and was on the floor crying. And he doesn't hear anything. Well, who does hear? His father, the Alter Rebbe, who lived on the bottom floor. So Alter Rebbe hears the cry, and he comes upstairs, and he picks up the child, calms the child down, wraps the child again, and puts the child back in the bassinet. Later on, he tells his son, Reb Dov Ber, that no matter how deep the concept, no matter how important the learning, no matter how profound the ideas that you're involved in, you can never ignore the cry of a child. You can never be in a place, wherever you are, intellectually, spiritually, you can never be in a place where you no longer pay attention, where you're not in tune with the cry of a child. In I believe it was Tafshin Chav Daled. It was 1964. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Yutes Kislev, which is the day where we celebrate and we mark the liberation of the Alter Rebbe from prison. And it really, in a way, marks the day where Chassidus really got a serious stamp of approval, both on high and below, from the Tsar and from the Russian government. The Rebbe spoke about this idea that every Jew needs to pay attention to the cry of another fellow, and specifically of another Jewish child, which is a euphemism for any Jewish person who is in a state of childhood. In other words, either physically, but perhaps what the Rebbe was primarily referring to was somebody who was in a state of childhood spiritually. Some people they never grew out of their infancy in terms of their spiritual growth. And that marked a turning point in what was later to become what's known today as the Kiruv movement. In essence, what the Rebbe was doing was arousing people to recognize the importance of hearing the cry of a neshama, even though it may not be that obvious. You may not notice it because you're involved in your thing, but if you pay attention, you'll see this is what's really happening. This was the time when the hippie movement was starting to develop, and it was clear that people wanted a deeper sense of spirituality, and in his great knowledge, he was able to sense that. In meeting people, he was able to sense where society was heading, what people were really looking for, and so it was being expressed in all kinds of wild parties and concerts, as we of course know. Bring up any name, but whatever the case, everybody knows what I'm talking about. So it expressed itself like that, but really, very often it comes from a very deep yearning within the person. So sometimes you have to pay attention. People will dress funny, people will do things very often it's really coming from a deep yearning within inside of them to connect with who they really are. We have to be attentive. We have to pay attention to the cry. And that's really what Miriam did. Miriam paid attention to the cry of the baby, to the cry of the child, and as a result, God returns the favor 500 times greater than the effort that we put in. Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to all those who joined us online. And we will, Be'ez Hashem, meet next Monday evening, same time, same place. Hopefully not the same pizza. Okay.